Her fingers trembled as they touched the torn parchment, the one that confirmed what she had never dared to imagine. Her own Alpha would sell her like an object, a bargaining chip, a walking apology to appease the wrath of a king she didn't even know. The cold wind cut at her exposed skin, but the real chill came from within, from the ancestral fear of being discarded as she always had been. Invisible, replaceable, nothing. Her sister coughed in the dark corner of the cabin, each sound scratching at Sage's soul with the reminder that there was no time, no choice, no future, if she simply accepted the fate drawn by hands that had never seen her as a person. Before we dive into this story, leave a comment with a rating from 1 to 10 and tell us what city you're joining us from. May this moment bring reflection and emotion to your heart. The settlement smelled of mud and resignation. Sage had grown up breathing that heavy air, thick with broken promises and failed harvests, where every family knew the bitter taste of working to the bone without ever having enough. From a young age, she had learned that Omegas like her were worth only what they could offer: skilled hands to heal, strong backs to carry, obedient silence so as not to bother. No one asked what she wanted. No one cared about the quiet fire that burned inside her, that suffocated need to be more, to mean something beyond servitude. Her younger sister Lila was all the family she had left. Their mother had died in childbirth. Their father had disappeared years later, swallowed by the woods or his own shame. No one knew for sure. Sage had taken on the role of protector before she even understood the weight of the word. She cared for, healed, and improvised remedies, with bitter roots and leaves she gathered at dawn, when the dew still clung to the plants, like the earth's tears. Lila had fallen ill last winter. The cough started light, almost innocent, but it worsened until it stole the colour from the girl's cheeks, until it left her too weak to get out of bed. Sage knew the name of the sickness. She also knew the cure. A rare plant that grew only in the distant mountains, territory controlled by the Alpha King, the man, whose reputation was woven with threads of fear and forced respect. No one approached those lands without a powerful reason. No one dared request an audience with the king without bringing worthy tributes. And Sage had nothing but calloused hands and a desperation that grew with each night Lila coughed blood into the wooden basin. That's when she discovered the plan. The alpha of her territory, a weak man disguised in authority, had gathered his advisors in secret. Sage had overheard by chance, hidden behind the straw wall of the main house, her heart hammering as the words pierced her, consciousness like daggers. He planned to offer her as a tribute to the Alpha King, a young, healthy Omega, skilled in healing, a gift to placate the sovereign's fury, who had been demanding explanations for the territory's growing misery, for unpaid taxes, for the blatant incompetence of the one who ruled there. The word tribute echoed in Sage's mind like a death sentence. She didn't sleep that night. She sat beside Lila, watching her sister's chest rise and fall with effort, each breath a fragile victory against the disease. The options laid themselves out cruelly in the darkness. Accept her fate and be handed over like cattle, or flee and let Lila die alone, abandoned, with no one to hold her hand when the fever returned. But there was a third possibility. Dangerous, improbable, almost suicidal. What if she went to the king herself? Not as a passive tribute, but as someone seeking a chance, someone offering something in exchange for something else. The thought was absurd. Omegas didn't negotiate with kings, didn't make demands, didn't present themselves without permission. But Sage had realized in those years of caring for the settlement's sick that true strength never came from shouting or imposition. It came from quiet persistence, from the refusal to disappear when you were expected to vanish. She prepared in silence for 3 days. She gathered the few medicinal herbs she had, sewed patches on her only decent set of clothes, and wrote detailed instructions for her neighbour to care for Lila. The girl cried when Sage explained she had to leave, but she didn't beg her to stay. Lila knew her sister too well. She knew that when Sage made up her mind, the world could fall apart, and she wouldn't turn back. The journey to the Alpha King's fortress took 4 days on foot. Sage crossed dense forests where sunlight could barely penetrate, forded icy streams that bit at her ankles, and slept leaning against trees with her stomach growling from hunger. Each step took her further from everything she knew and closer to a future impossible to predict. Fear walked beside her, whispering that she was crazy, that she would be humiliated, thrown out, perhaps killed for such audacity. But fear had never been strong enough to stop her. When the fortress finally appeared on the horizon, Sage stopped in the middle of the dusty road and just stared. The structure was immense, dark, built of grey stone that seemed to suck the light from its surroundings. Pointed towers tore at the cloudy sky. Banners fluttered in the wind, stamped with the kingdom's symbol. A wolf with open jaws ready to devour. Guards patrolled the walls, armed silhouettes who watched every movement with trained suspicion. Sage swallowed hard, adjusted the worn shawl over her shoulders and started walking. The gates were open. It was a day of tributes, she discovered upon hearing conversations among merchants waiting at the entrance. Alphas from smaller territories came to present offerings, renew oaths, and negotiate alliances. The main hall was filled with important people, powerful people, people who wore fine clothes and spoke with the arrogance of those who had never had to beg for anything. And then there was her. Sage entered slowly, feeling all eyes stick to her figure, like flies to spoiled honey. The silence that fell was almost physical. Conversations died mid-sentence. Goblets stopped in mid-air. Even the servants used to being invisible turned their heads to watch the road-stained Omega, who dared to step on that polished marble floor. At the far end of the hall, elevated, on a throne of dark wood carved with intertwined wolves, was him, the Alpha King. Sage didn't need to ask who he was. His presence dominated the room like a storm about to break. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a posture that didn't need to try to be intimidating. His face was sculpted in hard lines, jaw set, eyes studying each person with the coldness of someone calculating values and threats in seconds. He wore dark clothes, simple but impeccably cut, without unnecessary ostentation. He didn't need gold to prove his power. Power simply emanated from him. When the king's eyes landed on Sage, she felt the impact in her chest. It was like being seen and dissected at the same time. He showed no surprise, didn't frown, didn't show any reaction other than a slight narrowing of his eyes, almost imperceptible. He just watched, waiting, analysing what this out-of-place figure could mean. Sage forced her knees to stop shaking. She took a deep breath, ignoring the venomous whispers that began to spread along the sides of the hall, and took a step forward. "Your Majesty." Her voice came out firmer than she expected. "I request an audience." Muffled laughter erupted from strategic corners. Someone muttered something about insolence. Another commented that Omegas should know their place. Sage felt the heat of humiliation rise up her neck, but she kept her gaze fixed on the king, refusing to lower her head. The Alpha King raised a hand. The silence returned instantly. "Do you have a name?" His voice was deep, controlled, each word spoken with calculated precision. "Sage." "And what does a lone Omega want from me, Sage?" She hesitated for a fraction of a second, not because she doubted what she would say, but because she knew the next words would determine everything, life or death, a chance or ruin. "I've come to offer my services in exchange for an opportunity." The king tilted his head slightly, a gesture that could mean curiosity or disdain. "Services. I'm a healer. I know plants, herbs, treatments. I know how to work the land to bring back what seems lost." She paused, measuring each word. "I heard your gardens are abandoned. I can bring them back." New murmurs snaked through the hall. This time the tone was different. Some alphas exchanged doubtful glances. Others seemed offended by her audacity. The Alpha King, however, remained impassive, studying Sage as if trying to read something written between the lines of her posture. "And in return?" he asked, his voice still neutral. "Access to the northern mountains. There is a plant there that can save my sister." Silence. The king rose from his throne with slow, deliberate movements. He was even more imposing on his feet. He descended the steps that separated the throne from the rest of the hall, each step echoing on the marble like a drumbeat. He approached until he was just a few feet from Sage, too close for comfort, close enough for her to feel the intensity of that gaze piercing her makeshift courage. "You cross my kingdom alone, invade my hall uninvited, and dare to propose a bargain to me?" He spoke softly, but each word carried the weight of a mountain. Sage lifted her chin, meeting his eyes without looking away. "Yes." For a moment, something flickered across the king's face. It wasn't anger. Perhaps it was restrained surprise or disguised interest. It was hard to tell. He turned his back, returning to the throne with the same predatory calm as before, and sat down again. His gaze swept the hall, landing on a middle-aged man dressed in a councillor's robes. "Darius, show her the gardens. If there is visible progress in 2 weeks, we'll have news. If not, she leaves as she came." The sentence was passed. Sage bowed her head in a brief reverence, fighting the relief that threatened to dismantle her composure. She had done it. She didn't know if it was a victory or a trap, but it was a chance, and a chance was all she needed. As she left the hall, guided by the councillor Darius, she felt the weight of the stairs stuck to her back like invisible daggers. The real war was just beginning. The gardens were a green cemetery. Sage stopped at the entrance to the abandoned grounds and had to control her breathing to not show the shock that ran through every muscle. The councillor Darius watched from the side, arms crossed, his expression too neutral not to be intentional. He expected to see her back down. He expected surrender, fear, an admission of defeat before she even began. She didn't give him that satisfaction. What had once been a garden now looked like a lost battlefield. Weeds dominated every corner, tangled in thick mats that suffocated any plant that tried to survive. The soil was cracked, hard as stone, with no apparent life. Rusted tools lay scattered on the ground, abandoned in haste or neglect, impossible to know. A glass greenhouse at the far end had half its panes broken, shards scattered across the dead grass, reflecting the grey afternoon light. The smell was of mould, slow decay, rotted promises. "Here," Darius indicated with a vague gesture. "2 months ago we brought in a gardener from the south. An experienced man, or so he claimed. He lasted 3 weeks, before giving up, claimed the land was cursed." Sage walked among the ruined flower beds, crouching to touch the soil. The texture was strange, too compacted, as if it had been repeatedly trampled or simply ignored until it turned to brick. But it wasn't dead earth. There was potential there, hidden under layers of neglect. She recognized it the same way she recognized a fever in a patient still on their feet, signs invisible to those who didn't know how to look. "How much time do I have?" 2 weeks. The king was clear. She nodded, still crouching, her fingers digging into the hard earth. 2 weeks for the impossible. 2 weeks of being watched, judged, expected to fail. The entire fortress probably already knew about the wager. They were probably already laughing at her in the corridors, in the halls, in the kitchens. Let them laugh. "I'll need tools. Hose, shovels, watering cans. Seeds, if there are any. Manure, too." Darius arched an eyebrow, restrained surprise blooming beneath his mask of indifference. "You're serious?" "I always am." He studied her for a few more seconds, as if reassessing something, then turned and walked toward the exit. "I'll have them bring. What's possible? The rest is up to you." And then Sage was alone. The silence of the dead garden was dense, heavy with untold stories. She stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her worn skirt, and began to walk the grounds, memorizing every detail. Where the earth was most cracked, where there were still signs of living roots, where the sun hit the hardest, where the shade dominated. Knowledge was power, especially when physical power was non-existent. The tools arrived in the late afternoon, brought by 2 servants who deposited everything without a word and left quickly, as if fearing contamination. Sage ignored the implied contempt. She had work to do. She started by removing the weeds, a simple manual repetitive task. She pulled each invasive plant by the root, shaking off the clinging dirt before tossing it onto the growing pile beside her. Her hands soon became dirty, her nails dark with soil, her fingers scratched by hidden thorns. The sun set slowly, painting the sky a sickly orange, and she continued. When darkness fully set in, she lit an oil lamp she had found in the broken greenhouse and worked under the faint, flickering light. She didn't stop until midnight. When she finally returned to the tiny room they had assigned her, more a cell than a chamber, with a narrow bed and a small window, she collapsed fully clothed onto the thin mattress and slept like a stone. She woke before dawn. Her body complained, muscles protesting the previous day's effort, but Sage ignored it. Pain was an old companion. She washed her face in the basin of cold water, tied her hair in a tight braid, and returned to the gardens while the sky was still lightening in shades of grey. The routine established itself over the following days. Sage worked from sunrise until night swallowed everything. She weeded, tilled the earth with the hoe, breaking up hard clumps with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She fertilized the beds with manure that stank, but promised future life. She repaired the greenhouse with glass she borrowed from an abandoned castle window, improvising fittings with rope and patience. She planted seeds she had brought from home, tucked away at the bottom of her bag like secret treasures. Rosemary, mint, calendula. And as she worked, she felt the stares. There was always someone watching. Sometimes it was a guard patrolling the walls, whose attention lingered too long in the direction of the garden. Other times, maids crossed the courtyard carrying baskets and cast sidelong glances, whispering among themselves. Nobles occasionally appeared on the balconies, pointing, laughing softly, making comments Sage couldn't hear but could imagine. And there was Darius. The counsellor appeared every day, always at the same time, mid-afternoon, always with the same posture of crossed arms and a calculated expression. He never helped, he never hindered. He just observed, took mental notes, measured her progress with eyes that seemed to see beyond the surface. "You're doing well," he commented on the 5th day, his voice as neutral as ever. Sage didn't even lift her head, focused on transplanting a thyme seedling. "You sound surprised." "I am." She finally looked at him, wiping the sweat from her forehead with the back of her hand. "Why? Because I'm an Omega? Or because I come from a place too poor to be competent?" Darius didn't answer immediately. He studied her with renewed attention, as if seeing something he hadn't expected to find. Then, he turned and left without another word. Sage returned to her work, but the interaction kept hammering in. Her head. There was something about that man that bothered her. It wasn't open hostility that she would know how to recognize and handle. It was something else. Calculated interest. Attention that was too measured. As if he were assembling a puzzle, and she was a piece that didn't fit where it was supposed to. On the 7th day, the first act of sabotage occurred. Sage arrived at the garden in the morning to find 3 beds overturned, soil scattered, seedlings uprooted and thrown aside. Days of work destroyed during the night. She stopped at the entrance, her breath caught, her hands clenching into involuntary fists. The anger came quickly, hot, burning inside her like a swallowed coal. But anger fixed nothing. She took a deep breath, forcing calm to return, and began to repair the damage. She replanted what still had intact roots. She rearranged the soil. She worked twice as hard without a break to eat, until she had restored what had been destroyed. Darius appeared at his usual time. He looked at the repaired beds, then at Sage, who continued working without a word. "Did you have trouble?" "Nothing I can't handle." "Whoever did this should be punished." Sage finally stopped, dropping her shovel to the ground and facing the counsellor. "And are you going to find out who it was?" Silence. "I thought so." She went back to work. Darius remained there longer than usual, watching. When he finally left, Sage felt the weight of his gaze stick to her back like an unpronounced sentence. The sabotage happened again. Tools disappeared and reappeared in the wrong places. Seeds were swapped. The water in the watering cans was found muddied. Nothing big enough to report, but all calculated to undermine her progress, to tire her out, to break her. Sage adjusted, repaired, replanned. And the garden, despite everything, began to respond. Green shoots broke through the once-dead earth. Leaves unfurled shyly to the sun. The smell of mold gave way to something fresher, more alive. Small changes almost imperceptible to those not paying attention, but unmistakable to those who knew how to look. On the 10th day, Sage found the first flower, a solitary calendula, vibrant orange against the brown of the earth, its petals open like a stubborn promise. She crouched beside the flower, lightly touching the soft petals. And for the first time since arriving at the fortress, she smiled. That's when she felt the presence. She turned slowly and froze. The Alpha King was standing at the entrance to the garden. There were no guards, no counselors, just him, watching in silence, his expression as closed as the first time she had seen him. Sage didn't know how long he had been there. She didn't know if she should stand, bow, say something. She remained paralyzed, half-crouched beside the flower, her heart racing. He took a step forward. "Darius informed me of the problems." His voice was different there in the open space of the garden, less echoing than in the stone hall, but the weight remained the same. Sage stood up slowly, wiping her hands on her skirt out of pure reflex. "I'm handling it. Have you found out who it is?" "No." The king walked among the beds, examining the seedlings, the tilled soil, the stubborn shoots that insisted on growing. Sage followed him only with her eyes, not moving, not knowing what to do with her own hands. He stopped beside the calendula, observing the flower for too long. "Why this plant?" he asked without looking at her. "It's resilient. It grows in difficult soil. It heals wounds." The king raised his eyes, meeting hers for the first time since he had entered the garden, and Sage felt, in that instant, something shift in the air between them. She couldn't name it. She didn't understand it. But it was palpable, dense, dangerous. 2 weeks, he said, his voice low. "You have 4 days. There will be enough." "I hope so." He turned to leave but stopped halfway as if remembering something. "Sage." It was the first time he had said her name since the hall. "Yes, Your Majesty." "Sleep with your door locked." And then he was gone, leaving her alone in the garden with the orange flower and a shiver that ran down her spine without permission. That night, Sage locked her door. The fortress woke before the sun. Sage could hear the movement through the stone corridors even before it was light, the boots of marching guards, servants dragging buckets of water, doors creaking on hinges that begged for oil. The castle's routine was a well-oiled machine, precise, functioning without needing repeated orders. Everything had its place, everything had its function. And she, a foreign Omega who had dared to bargain with the king, didn't fit in anywhere. The stares continued, but their quality had changed. Before they were of pure disdain, the automatic contempt reserved for those unworthy of attention. Now they carried something sharper, venomous curiosity, poorly disguised envy, growing resentment, because the garden was flourishing, because Sage hadn't broken, because the impossible wager seemed less impossible with each passing day, and that bothered important people. On the morning of the 12th day, Sage found a woman standing at the entrance to the garden. Tall, with an erect posture that screamed nobility, she wore a dress of fine fabric, in a dark green shade embroidered with gold thread. Her hair was pulled back in an elaborate braid, discreet but expensive jewels glittering in her ears. Her face was beautiful in a calculated way, with symmetrical features and clear, unblemished skin. But her eyes were those of a snake sizing up its prey. "So you're the miracle Omega?" The voice was too sweet, venom disguised as honey. Sage put down the watering can she was carrying, wiping her hands on her makeshift apron. "I'm Sage. And you are?" The woman smiled, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. "Lady Isabel. An advisor to the kingdom. I believe we haven't had the pleasure of a formal introduction." A lie. Isabel had been in the hall on the day of Sage's arrival. She had watched everything from the side, whispering with other noblewomen, laughing softly. Sage remembered perfectly. "What can I do for you, Lady Isabel?" "Oh, just curiosity." She walked among the beds with measured steps, careful not to soil her soft leather boots. "I've heard so much about your work. I wanted to see it with my own eyes." Sage didn't reply, she just watched, her sharp instincts picking up the tension the woman carried disguised as elegance. Isabel stopped beside the repaired greenhouse, her fingers sliding over the improvised glass panes. "Impressive work for someone of your origins." A pause. "But tell me, what happens after the 2 weeks?" "What do you mean?" "Well, the king authorized your expedition to the mountains if you succeeded. And from what I see, you will." Her eyes fixed on Sage with calculated intensity. "But after you retrieve your plant and heal your sister, what will you do? Return to your settlement? Or do you plan to stay here?" The question was a trap. Sage recognized its shape. "I haven't thought that far ahead." "You should." Isabel smiled again, that sharp smile that cut without drawing blood. "The fortress is no place for those who don't understand its rules. I've seen many try to establish themselves here without the necessary strength. It never ends well." "Is that a threat?" "Advice." Isabel moved closer, closing the distance between them until she was too close, invading Sage's personal space with the confidence of one who always could. "You're clever, I'll give you that. Brave too, in a way. But courage without protection is just another word for stupidity." Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. "The king is a powerful man, Sage, and powerful men have powerful enemies. Be careful not to become a pawn in games you don't understand." Before Sage could respond, Isabel was already backing away, returning to her impeccable posture as a lady of the court. "It was a pleasure to meet you formally. I hope you succeed on your journey." A pause. "Be careful in the mountains. Terrible things happen in isolated places." And then she was gone, leaving behind only the scent of expensive perfume and the feeling of a veiled threat hanging in the air. Sage stood still for minutes after Isabel's departure, processing the interaction, analyzing each word chosen with surgical precision. The woman hadn't come out of curiosity. She had come to measure, to evaluate, perhaps to intimidate, to find out what Sage represented and if she was worth eliminating. The question was, why? What threat did an Omega gardener pose to someone like Lady Isabel? She returned to her work, but the conversation echoed in her head like a dissonant bell. That afternoon, Darius appeared earlier than usual. "The king wants to see you." Sage froze, her dirt-caked hands still holding the small trowel. "Now? Now!" She left her tools, tried to wipe the worst of the dirt from her hands, and followed the counsellor through the labyrinthine corridors of the fortress. The path was different from the one leading to the main hall. Darius led her through narrower, less ornate passages, until they stopped before a dark wooden door. He knocked twice. "Enter," the king's voice came from within, deep and clear. Darius opened the door but didn't go in. He just gestured for Sage to pass and closed it behind her, leaving. Her alone. The room was an office. The walls were lined with shelves full of books, maps hung on the walls, and a large desk was covered with documents, parchments, and wax seals. A wide window dominated the opposite wall, offering a view of the distant, perpetually snow-capped mountains. And by the window, his back to her, stood the Alpha King. He turned slowly. He wore simple clothes, a dark shirt, leather pants, worn boots. His hair was slightly disheveled, as if he had run his hands through it several times during the day. He looked tired. Still, his presence remained, imposing, magnetic, impossible to ignore. Sit, he indicated a chair in front of the desk. Sage obeyed, uncomfortable with the situation, with the proximity, with being alone with him in a closed room. The king walked to the desk but didn't sit. He stood, leaning against the edge, arms crossed, studying her with an attention that made her skin tingle. In 2 days, you will have met the deadline. The gardens show significant progress. I will honor my part of the agreement. Sage nodded, not knowing what to say. I will organize an expedition to the mountains. 3 guards will accompany you. They will carry enough provisions for 5 days. He paused. Darius will go as well. Why? The question slipped out before she could filter it. The king arched an eyebrow. Do you trust strangers more than my counselor? I don't trust anyone. A corner of his mouth turned up slightly. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the closest thing Sage had seen so far. Smart. A silence settled, dense and charged with something Sage couldn't name. The king watched her with a burning intensity, as if trying to read thoughts written in a foreign language. Lady. Isabel paid me a visit today, Sage said, breaking the silence. His expression didn't change, but something hardened in his jaw. And? She advised me to be careful. Isabel is known for her advice. The tone was too neutral. She warned me about powerful enemies. The king moved away from the desk, walking to the window, turning his back to Sage again. He watched the mountains in silence for too long. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost reflective. Power attracts enemies like a wound attracts flies. The more you have, the more they want to take. A pause. Isabel knows this dynamic well. She herself is a skilled player. Is she playing now? He turned his head slightly, looking at Sage over his shoulder. Everyone is. Always. And me? Am I a piece or a player? The king turned completely, walking back until he stood before her. Sage had to lift her head to maintain eye contact, her heart beating too fast, her breathing controlled by force. He leaned down, placing his hands on the arms of the chair where she sat, trapping her without touching her. His face was dangerously close. You, he said, his voice, as low as distant thunder, are an anomaly. You don't fit into any category I know, and that bothers me. Sage held her breath. His scent invaded everything. Wood, leather, something wild that made the Omega instinct inside her want to retreat and draw closer at the same time. I'm trying to decide, he continued, if you are a threat or an opportunity. And have you reached a conclusion? His eyes dropped to Sage's mouth, lingered there for an eternal second, then met hers again. Not yet. The tension in the air was physical, palpable, electric. Sage felt every inch between them like both an abyss and a bridge. She wanted to pull away. She wanted to stay. She wanted to understand what was happening in her own body, in her own reactions. The king abruptly pulled away, moving back behind the desk, putting a safe distance between them. Prepare to leave in 3 days. Rest tomorrow. The journey will be demanding. It was a dismissal. Sage stood up, her legs trembling slightly, and walked to the door. With her hand on the knob, she turned. Your Majesty? Yes. Why are you helping me? A long silence. When he answered, he wasn't looking at her. I'm still deciding. Sage left the office with more questions than answers, and the feeling that something much bigger than gardens and medicinal plants was at stake. The next day, as promised, she rested, but the rest brought no peace. At night, lying in the narrow bed, staring at the cracked ceiling, Sage replayed every interaction, every look, every word exchanged with the king. There was something there, something dangerous, something that frightened and attracted her in equal measure. She thought of Leela, of her sick sister waiting at home. She thought of the plant she needed to find. She thought of the garden that had begun to flourish against all odds. And she thought of the Alpha King's eyes when he had come too close, his low voice, his overwhelming presence. She turned on her side, pulling the thin blanket up to her chin. In 3 days she would leave for the mountains. In 3 days everything could change again. The morning of their departure dawned shrouded in a thick fog. Sage woke before dawn, her body tense with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. She packed the few things she would take, a change of clothes, basic herbs for emergencies, the detailed drawing of the plant she was looking for, copied from an old book she had found in the fortress library. Everything fit into a worn leather bag she had carried since leaving home. When she went down to the courtyard, the guards were already waiting. 3 men, all tall and muscular, armed with swords and knives, their serious faces showing no emotion. They sized her up with quick glances, evaluating, categorizing. One of them spat on the ground, a subtle gesture of contempt. Another simply ignored her presence, adjusting his horse's saddle with mechanical movements. Darius stood beside the animals, supervising the final preparations. When he saw Sage, he nodded, a formal distant greeting. "Ready?" "Yes." He pointed to a smaller horse, a brown one with a white patch on its forehead. "Do you know how to ride?" "More or less." "You'll have to learn fast. We don't have time for a slow ride." Sage approached the animal, stroking its neck carefully. The horse snorted, shaking its head, but didn't pull away. She put her foot in the stirrup and mounted with an effort, almost slipping before steadying herself in the saddle. The guards exchanged looks that clearly said, "This is going to be a long one." That's when he appeared. The Alpha King crossed the courtyard with long strides, wearing a dark cloak that billowed behind him like a crow's wings. He stopped beside Sage's horse, looking up at her with a closed expression that revealed nothing. "The route is marked on the map Darius is carrying. 5 days round trip at most. If you don't return by the 6th day, I'll send a search party." Sage nodded, gripping the reins between her nervous fingers. The king took a step closer, his voice dropping so only she could hear. "Don't trust anyone completely. Not even those I've sent." Before she could respond, he was already backing away, nodding to Darius. "Depart." And so the group set off, passing through the fortress gates as the sun began to break through the fog in weak, silvery rays. The road to the mountains was rough. It started wide, paved with uneven stones, surrounded by cultivated fields where peasants were already bent over the land. But as they advanced, civilization was left behind. The fields gave way to wild pastures, then to dense pine forests that blocked. The sun, then to rocky terrain where only low shrubs could survive. They rode in silence for hours. The guards rode ahead, maintaining a tight formation. Darius rode beside Sage, his posture erect, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings. She tried to start a conversation a few times, but he responded with monosyllables, clearly uninterested in intimacy. They made their first stop at noon. They dismounted in a small clearing surrounded by gnarled trees. One of the guards, a man with a greying beard named Thomas, quickly lit a fire to heat water. Another, younger with a scar on his face, distributed pieces of dry bread and salted meat. Sage ate in silence, sitting on a rock away from the group, observing the dynamic between them. Darius approached, sitting beside her without asking permission. "Are you holding up?" "Yes. The hard part hasn't even started." He bit into his bread, chewing slowly. "Tomorrow we enter the real mountain terrain. Intense cold, narrow trails, the possibility of snow." "I'm prepared." He studied her in that peculiar way of his, as if trying to read something written in code. Why are you doing this? What? Risking so much for a sister? Most would give up. Sage took a sip of warm water from her canteen. Do you have siblings? I did. He died years ago. Then you know why. Darius nodded slowly, something like understanding crossing his face before being tucked away again behind his neutral mask. They rode until nightfall. They set up camp in an area protected by large rocks that blocked the wind. Thomas lit a larger fire which crackled cheerfully against the growing darkness. The other guards would take turns on watch. Sage was given a thin blanket and a spot near the fire. She lay curled in the rough fabric, watching the flames dance, listening to the nocturnal sounds of the forest, crickets, wind, snapping twigs. She was exhausted, but sleep was slow to come. Her mind spun in circles, replaying the king's warning. Don't trust anyone completely. Why? What did he know that she didn't? Finally, exhaustion won, and she slept. She woke to a hand shaking her shoulder. It was still dark. The fire was burning low. Darius was crouched beside her, a finger to his lips, signaling for silence. Get dressed, quickly. His tone made Sage's heart race. She got up, grabbing her bag, and followed, the counselor to where the horses were tied. The 3 guards were also awake, moving with the silent efficiency of men who expected trouble. What happened? Sage whispered. Someone's following us. Are you sure? Thomas heard horses in the distance. Could be bandits, could be something else. Darius checked the sword at his waist. We're getting out of here before we find out. They mounted in a hurry, smothered the fire with dirt, and set off on the trail still shrouded in darkness. The horses felt their way carefully, guided more by instinct than sight. Sage held the reins tightly, praying she wouldn't fall. The first light of day found them climbing the mountain. The path had narrowed dramatically. On one side, a rock wall rose vertically. On the other, a precipice dropped into a fog-covered abyss. The horses stepped cautiously, feeling for every loose stone. Sage kept her eyes fixed ahead, refusing to look down. It was Thomas who noticed it first. The map is wrong. Everyone stopped. Darius pulled out the parchment he carried, studying it with a frown. What do you mean, wrong? This trail shouldn't be this narrow. And the fork that's shown here, he pointed, should have appeared 2 hours ago? Sage felt her stomach tighten. Are we lost? No. Darius folded the map, his jaw tense. But someone altered the route. Their eyes met. The same unspoken question hung between them all. Was it intentional or a mistake? Can we go back? The youngest guard asked. And go where? Thomas retorted. If people are following us, going back is worse. We press on, Darius decided, his voice firm. With extra caution. They continued to climb. The cold intensified as they gained altitude. The air thinned, making it harder to breathe. Snow began to appear, in patches, then in a thin layer, then covering everything. The horses slipped, snorting steam from their nostrils. They stopped around noon to rest the animals. Sage dismounted, her legs numb, and slapped her arms against her body to ward off the cold. Darius beckoned to her. Do you recognize anything? He gestured to the surrounding landscape, snow-covered rocks, gnarled pines, the mountain rising even higher ahead. Sage looked carefully, mentally comparing it to the descriptions she had read about where the plant grew. I need to go higher. The plant only grows above the permanent snow line. How much? Higher? I don't know exactly. I'll know it when I see it. Thomas snorted in frustration. This is insane. We'll climb until we freeze looking for a plant that might not even exist. It exists, Sage replied, her voice firm. And I'm going to find it. The guard was about to retort when the sound echoed. Distant but unmistakable galloping horses. Everyone froze. How many? Darius whispered. Thomas closed his eyes, listening intently. A lot. Maybe 6. 8. Armed? Definitely. The counselor made a quick decision. We abandon the horses. We'll continue on foot, climb the rocks where they can't follow. Us mounted. And then? The young guard asked, fear creeping into his voice. Then we improvise. They released the horses, took only the essentials, weapons, water, Sage's bag, and began to climb. The ascent was brutal, rocks slippery with ice, a biting wind that pierced any clothing, numb fingers that could barely grip. Sage climbed behind Darius, who tested each foothold before showing her where to step. The guards followed, tense, constantly looking down. The sounds of pursuit grew closer. Echoing voices, shouted orders, the clang of metal. Faster, Darius urged. Sage pushed her legs beyond their limit, climbing, pulling, dragging her. Own weight. Her hands bled where the skin had torn on sharp rocks. It didn't matter. She had to keep going. They reached a narrow ledge. They turned to help the guards who were still climbing. That's when the arrow hit. Thomas screamed, losing his grip, and plummeted. The young guard tried to grab him, but the weight was too much. They both fell, disappearing into the fog below with screams that were lost in the wind. Sage stood paralyzed, horror coursing through every cell. Darius pulled her hard. Run! And then they were running, climbing, fleeing, as more arrows cut through the air around them, and hostile voices shouted orders that Sage couldn't understand. The ambush was no accident. It was a planned execution. And they were the targets. The cold burned her lungs. Sage ran blindly, stumbling over rocks hidden beneath the snow, following Darius, who moved ahead with the determination of someone who knew the mountains better than she had imagined. The arrows had stopped, too high, a bad angle, but the shouts of their pursuers still echoed below, as persistent as wolves on a blood trail. Darius pulled her into a narrow crevice between the rocks. They both pressed themselves against the icy stone, their panting breaths creating clouds of vapor that dissipated quickly. A forced silence. Hearts beating too loudly, Sage felt her whole body tremble from cold, fear, and exhaustion. "How much time do we have?" she whispered. "Not much." Darius checked his sword, then looked at her with urgency. "We need to get higher, find the plant, and get down by another route. Thomas and the other one? They're dead." His voice was hard, final. "We can't help them now." Sage closed her eyes, swallowing the nausea that rose in her throat. 2 men dead. Because of her. Because of a plant. Because of choices that had seemed to make sense before everything fell apart. "Why are they doing this?" She looked at Darius, searching for answers. "Who are these people?" He hesitated. For the first time since she'd met him, she saw a crack in his mask of absolute control. "They're not common bandits." "I know that. They're soldiers, trained." A heavy pause. "Someone wants you dead, Sage. Someone with the resources and authority to organize this." The information landed like a stone in a still pond, its implications rippling outward. Lady Isabel. Perhaps? Darius peered out of the crevice, checking if they were safe. "She has motives. You represent change, and change threatens the order that benefits her." "But the king?" "The king has enemies within his own court. Isabel isn't the only one." He looked back at her, his expression serious. "Some want to destabilize him, to use your death as a catalyst, to accuse him of negligence, of weakness. You've become more important than you realize." Sage felt the world spin slightly. Everything was connecting in a sinister way. The sabotage in the gardens, the ambiguous warnings, the altered map, the precise ambush. You knew. It wasn't a question. It was an accusation. Darius didn't look away. "I suspected. I wasn't sure. And you brought me anyway." "The king's orders." A pause. "But also, I wanted to see if my suspicions were correct." Anger rose hot in Sage's chest, boiling despite the cold. "You used me as bait." "Yes." The brutal honesty cut deeper than a lie. Sage wanted to scream, to hit him, to run. But there was nowhere to go. She was trapped on a frozen mountain, hunted by assassins, alongside the only man who could help her survive, even if he was the man who had put her there. Did the king know? No. Darius rubbed his face, exhaustion showing through. He never would have authorized it if he knew the real risk. Why? I'm nothing to him. Darius looked at her with something like pity mixed with reluctant understanding. You really don't see it, do you? See what? But before he could answer, voices echoed too close. There! I saw movement. Surround the area, Darius cursed under his breath, grabbing Sage by the arm. Let's go. Now. They shot out of the crevice, climbing higher, their fingers bleeding as they gripped sharp rocks, their knees banging against stone. The terrain became impossible, almost vertical, covered in ice that made every move a lottery between climbing and falling. Sage slipped. Darius's hand clamped around her wrist with a force that hurt, pulling her back up. She clung to a ledge, breathing in desperate gasps. Can you keep going? She nodded, too breathless for words. They climbed, and climbed, until the terrain finally began to level out, opening onto a wide plateau covered in virgin snow. The wind whipped mercilessly, so cold it hurt to breathe. But there, growing among black rocks that broke through the snow like the bones of a dead giant, Sage saw it. The plant, small, discreet, with dark green leaves and silvery veins, its delicate purple flowers swaying in the wind. Exactly like the drawings in the books. Exactly what she had come for. She staggered toward the plant, falling to her knees, her hands shaking so much she could barely hold the small knife she would use to harvest it. She cut carefully, preserving the roots, wrapping it all in a cloth she had brought specifically for this purpose. Darius watched the trail they had come up, sword in hand. You have it? I have it. Then we need to get out of here before... The first attacker appeared out of nowhere, dressed in dark clothes that blended with the rock, his face covered by a scarf, his sword already raised. Darius blocked the blow at the last second, metal singing against metal. The two men grappled, moving with brutal speed. Sage saw two other attackers appear on the trail. She ran. She didn't think. She just ran, clutching the bag to her chest, her feet sinking into the snow, her lungs burning. She heard Darius shout something, but the words were lost in the wind. One of the attackers came after her, fast, determined, gaining ground. Sage looked around desperately, searching for an escape. She saw a narrow gorge between the rocks and threw herself into it without knowing where it led. The space was too tight for an adult to pass through easily, but she was small, thin from years of poor nutrition. She squeezed between the stones, scraping her shoulders, tearing her clothes. Her pursuer tried to follow but got stuck, too large. She came out the other side and kept running, now descending, slipping more than walking down the steep slope. Loose rocks rolled with her, creating small avalanches. She fell several times, got up, fell again, until the ground simply disappeared. She plummeted in a free fall, screaming, hitting ledges that slowed her descent but hurt her violently. She landed in a deep snowbank that cushioned the impact but swallowed her whole. She lay there, submerged in icy white, disoriented, not knowing which way was up. She forced herself to move, swimming through the snow until she broke the surface, gasping, spitting out ice. She was in a deep ravine, surrounded by stone walls, alone. The bag was still safe against her chest. Thank all the gods. She tried to stand, but her right leg wouldn't obey. She looked down and saw her ankle swelling, a purple bruise spreading under the skin. Sprained, maybe broken. Tears burned in her eyes, frustration, pain, fear. No, she whispered to herself, not now, not when I'm so close. She used a rock to support herself, testing the leg. It could bear weight, but pain exploded with every step. It didn't matter. She had to move. She limped through the ravine, following what seemed to be a downward path, praying it would lead somewhere safe. Time ceased to make sense. Hours or minutes could have passed. It all blurred into a haze of pain and cold and stubborn determination. Sage stumbled, fell, got up. She repeated the cycle countless times until she heard it. Running water. She followed the sound like a castaway following a star. She found a small stream, half frozen but still flowing. She drank with trembling hands, the water so cold it hurt her teeth. And that's when she heard horses. She froze, hiding behind a large rock. She expected to see the attackers, expected to have to run again on a leg that barely worked. But the voice that echoed was not an enemy's. Search everywhere. I want every ravine, every cave, every damn rock turned over until you find her. Sage would recognize that voice anywhere. The Alpha King. She staggered out from behind the rock, nearly falling. Here! Her voice came out hoarse, weak. I'm here! Silence. Then horses approaching at a gallop, figures appearing between the rocks. And then he was there. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, running to her, grabbing her by the shoulders, his eyes scanning every inch of her for injuries. Are you all right? Are you hurt? The questions came out fast, urgent, his voice laced with something Sage had never heard before. Fear. My leg. I fell. But I got the plant. She showed him the bag. He didn't even look at it. He continued to examine her, his hands running over her arms, her face checking. Darius? She asked. Alive. Wounded but alive. He killed 2 attackers before escaping and returning to the fortress. His jaw was tight, contained fury vibrating beneath the surface. He's the one who warned me. It wasn't his fault. I know. The king scooped her up into his arms, ignoring her protests. I know exactly whose fault it is. He carried her to his horse, mounting with her still in his arms, settling her in front of him, wrapping her in his own cloak. Return to the fortress, he ordered the guards accompanying him. Take the prisoners. Only then did Sage notice. 3 men tied up, the scarves now removed from their faces. The attackers. You captured them? Some of them. His voice was sharp ice. The others weren't so lucky. He spurred his horse into a gallop, descending the mountain with the skill of someone who knew every trail by heart. Sage was warm for the first time in hours, enveloped by his cloak, by his arms, by the heat of his body pressed against her back. The pain in her leg throbbed distantly. The fear slowly dissipated. How did you know where to find me? She asked softly. When Darius returned alone, he told me everything. I organized a search party immediately. A pause. I won't lie, Sage. I thought I'd be too late. She turned her head slightly, enough to see his profile. But you weren't. The arms around her tightened imperceptibly. No, I wasn't. They rode in silence, descending toward the fortress that rose in the distance, its towers silhouetted against the darkening sky. And Sage, exhausted, sore but alive and holding the plant that would save her sister, allowed herself to fully relax for the first time in days. She didn't know what she would find upon her return. She didn't know who would pay for what had happened. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. Something had irrevocably changed between her and the man who held her in his arms. The storm was just beginning. The fortress received them like a tomb swallowing the damned. The heavy gates opened, creaking on hinges that echoed through the empty courtyards. Guards lined up in a tense formation, their faces grim, hands on their weapons. Servants peeked from dark corners, whispering among themselves. The atmosphere was charged, electric, on the verge of exploding. Sage felt it all through a haze of pain and exhaustion. The Alpha King dismounted first, then lifted her from the horse with a care that contrasted violently with the rigidity of his jaw, the contained fury vibrating in every movement. She tried to stand, but her leg gave way. He caught her before she could fall. "Call the healer," he commanded, his voice as sharp as a blade. Now. 2 servants ran to obey the order. The king carried Sage through the corridors, ignoring the stares, the whispers, the presences that scurried away from his path like water from a hot stone. He took her directly to his own chambers. Sage vaguely registered her surroundings. The room was large, furnished with a simplicity that bordered on austerity, a wide bed covered with dark blankets, a lit fireplace casting dancing shadows. He placed her on the bed gently, moving away only to light more lamps. The door opened unceremoniously. A healer hurried in, an old man with white hair and steady hands, carrying a leather bag full of vials and instruments. Behind him came Darius, a bandage wrapped around his right shoulder, bloodstains drying on the fabric. "Your Majesty?" The healer bowed his head in a quick reverence before approaching Sage. "Where does it hurt?" "My right ankle," she answered, her voice hoarse. He examined it with an expert touch, pressing on specific points, watching her reactions. Sage bit her lip to keep from crying out. "A bad sprain. It's not broken, but it needs absolute rest for at least 2 weeks." The healer prepared a poultice with herbs that smelled like something between mint and wet earth. "I'll immobilize it and leave an ointment for the pain." While he worked, the king and Darius conversed in a far corner, their voices low but intense. Sage caught fragments. 3 prisoners confirmed. The order came from within the court. Isabel denies involvement, but enough evidence for... When the healer finished, he stood up, wiping his hands. "Done. She needs to rest. Eat something. Warm, and keep her leg elevated." He looked at the king. "Shall I take her to her own chambers?" "No." The answer was firm, final. "She stays here." The healer blinked in surprise but didn't question it. He bowed again and left, closing the door behind him. Darius remained, watching Sage with a complex expression. Guilt, respect, something harder to name. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "You did what you thought was necessary," Sage replied, too tired for anger. "And we survived." Thomas and Kieran didn't. A heavy silence fell over the room. The king turned from the window where he had been watching the night. "Leave us." Darius nodded, exiting without another word. Alone. The king remained standing, his back to her, looking through the glass at the darkness outside. Sage watched him, waiting, feeling the tension radiate from him like heat from a forge. "I almost lost you," he finally said, his voice low, too controlled. "But you didn't. By luck. By stubbornness. Not by my competence to protect you." He turned, and Sage saw a crack in the impenetrable armor he always wore. "I failed." "You didn't know? I should have known?" His voice exploded, reverberating off the walls. "It's my kingdom, my court, my people. I should have seen the betrayal forming under my own roof." He walked to her, stopping beside the bed, looking down at her with a burning intensity. "Why you? Why would someone invest so much in killing an Omega who only wants to save her sister?" Sage held his gaze. "Darius said I became a piece in a larger game." "Darius is right." The king pulled over a chair, sitting heavily, and rubbed his face. "Isabel and others in the court want to see me weakened. They want power that I won't grant. Your presence, the fact that you achieved the impossible in the gardens, that I gave you my attention, it threatened them." "Attention," Sage repeated the word, testing it. "Is that all it is?" His eyes met hers and something passed between them, a silent admission, an unspoken truth. "You know it's not just that." Sage's heart beat faster. "Then what is it?" He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, so close she could see every detail of his face. The thin scar on his left eyebrow, the lines of exhaustion around his eyes, the way his jaw moved when, he thought before speaking. "You challenge everything I've built to protect myself," he admitted, his voice hoarse. "You arrive with nothing, ask for the impossible, and achieve it. You don't bow. You're not afraid. Or you are, but you don't let it stop you." A pause. "You make me question rules I've always followed blindly." "Rules like what?" "Like keeping my distance, like not trusting, like never showing weakness." His eyes burned. "You are a weakness, Sage, and I can't stay away." The brutal honesty stole the air from her lungs. "I didn't ask to be." "I know. That makes it worse." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated. Isabel saw it before I did. She saw that you have an influence that no counsellor, no noblewoman, no political ally has ever had, not because you scheme, but because you simply exist. Sage didn't know what to say. His words were rearranging realities, revealing depths she hadn't explored, hadn't wanted to see. "What happens now?" she asked softly. "Now I deal with the traitors." His voice hardened again, the king returning. "The prisoners have already confessed. Isabel will be confronted tomorrow publicly. Others involved as well. And after?" "After?" He took her hand, surprising her. His fingers were warm, calloused, strong. "After, you rest, you heal, you prepare the plant for your sister. And then we make decisions about the future." "What kind of decisions?" He squeezed her hand lightly. "Decisions about whether you stay or go, about what place you hold here, about us." The word hung in the air, us, laden with possibilities and impossibilities in equal measure. Before Sage could respond, a knock on the door interrupted the moment. "Your Majesty," a guard's voice came from the other side. "Lady Isabel demands an audience." The king stood, releasing Sage's hand, his mask slipping back into place. "Tell her I will see her in the morning, in the main hall, with the entire court present. She insists it's urgent. In the morning," he repeated in a tone that brooked no argument. Footsteps receded. Silence returned. The king looked at Sage. "Sleep. Tomorrow will be a long day. Will you stay?" The question slipped out before she could filter it. He stopped halfway to the door. "Do you want me to stay?" Sage knew she should say no. She knew it was inappropriate, risky, complicated. But exhaustion and fear and loneliness spoke louder. "Yes." He returned, pulling an armchair close to the bed, sitting in a position that suggested a long vigil. "Then I'll stay." Sage settled into the blankets, so much softer than anything she had ever touched, watching him through heavy eyelids. His presence was an anchor, a silent promise of safety. When sleep finally came, it took the fear with it and left only the peculiar warmth of knowing she wasn't alone. She woke to sunlight streaming into the room. The king was still in the armchair, sleeping in an uncomfortable position, his hair dishevelled, his expression softer in sleep. Sage watched him for a stolen moment, memorizing the image, a vulnerability he would never show while awake. Then he opened his eyes. They met hers immediately, and for an eternal second they just looked at each other, without masks, without defences. "How's your leg?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep. "Sore but bearable." He nodded, standing up, stretching tense muscles. "I need to prepare. I'll have food brought for you." He walked to the door, then stopped. "Sage?" "Yes?" "Thank you." "For what?" "For surviving." And then he left, leaving her alone with words that resonated like an intertwined promise and fear. A few hours later, a maid came for her. "The king requests your presence in the hall." The young woman looked at the floor, nervous. "If you can walk, of course." Sage tested her leg. It hurt violently, but it held her weight. She used a makeshift cane someone had left, leaning against the wall, and followed the maid through the corridors. The hall was packed. Nobles, councillors, guards, servants, all squeezed together, murmuring anxiously. At the front, standing before the empty throne, was Lady Isabel. Still impeccably dressed, still with an erect posture, but something was different around her eyes. Fear disguised as arrogance. When Sage limped in, a hush fell like a blade. All eyes locked on her, some hostile, others curious, many simply shocked to see her alive. The king entered shortly after, striding through the hall with steps that echoed like drumbeats. He sat on the throne, his gaze sweeping over those present before settling on Isabel. "Lady Isabel," his voice rang out, clear and relentless. "You are accused of conspiracy, attempted murder, and treason against the kingdom." Murmurs erupted. Isabel paled but lifted her chin. "Absurd. I have no involvement with—" "3 prisoners have confessed," the king interrupted, They detailed exactly who hired them, how much they were paid, and what orders they received. They're lying to save their own skins. Perhaps, he leaned forward. But we also found correspondence, payments, enough evidence for a trial. Isabel's face finally crumbled. And Sage, watching from a corner, understood that this moment wasn't just about justice. It was about power being reconfigured. It was about the king showing that no one touched what he protected. It was about the future being decided right there, right now, in front of everyone. The storm had reached its peak. The trial lasted 3 hours. Sage remained standing throughout the entire proceeding, refusing the offered chair, using the cane for support and the throbbing pain in her leg as an anchor to reality. Witnesses were called. Evidence was presented. Confessions were read aloud, echoing through the hall like death sentences. Isabel denied everything to the end, but when the final document was displayed, a letter signed in her own hand, promising payment to the mercenaries, something broke. The mask of superiority cracked, revealing not remorse but pure rage beneath. "She doesn't belong here," Isabel shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Sage. "She's an Omega from a wretched settlement, with no noble blood, no education, nothing. And yet he—" Her voice failed, fury twisting into something more bitter. "Yet he looks at her as he has never looked at any of us." An absolute silence fell. The king rose slowly, descending the steps of the throne, walking until he stood before Isabel. When he spoke, his voice was cutting ice. "You are right. Sage has no noble blood, no titles, nothing that you and others deem important." A heavy pause. "But she has something you all lost over years of intrigue and political games. Integrity." He turned to the entire hall, his gaze sweeping over every face. "This court has rotted from within. Nobles protecting nobles, secrets hoarded like currency, loyalty conditional on benefits." His voice rose, echoing. "Sage arrived with nothing and achieved what experts declared impossible. Not because she had connections or power, but because she worked, because she didn't give up, because she is genuine in a world of masks." He looked back at Isabel. "Your sentence is permanent exile. You will leave the kingdom before sunset. Your lands and titles are forfeit. Any return will be treated as treason and punished as such." Isabel opened her mouth to protest, but guards were already approaching, escorting her out. She shot one last look of pure hatred at Sage before disappearing through the gates. Other conspirators were tried in succession. Some were exiled, others imprisoned. One was executed for a prior treason the trial had revealed. The king was relentless, methodical, turning the hall into a stage for a justice the court hadn't seen in years. When it was over, the sun was already setting. "All are dismissed," the king ordered, "except for Sage." The hall emptied slowly, nobles and servants leaving in a tense silence, casting furtive glances behind them. Darius was the last to leave, offering a discreet nod before closing the doors. Alone again. The king came all the way down to the floor, approaching Sage. She remained standing, her leg pulsing with pain, but her determination keeping her upright. "You can sit," he said, more gently. "I'd rather stand." He almost smiled. "Stubborn? A survivor?" This time he did smile, small and fleeting, but real. "You are free to leave. I have horses prepared to take you back to your settlement. The plant is with the healer, who will instruct you on its proper use." A pause. "Your sister will be cured." It was everything Sage had come for, everything she had risked her life to get. She should have been happy, relieved, eager to go back, but her chest felt strangely tight. "And what if I don't want to leave?" The king studied her for a long moment. "Why would you stay? You got what you came for. Here there is only danger, intrigue, people who hate you for representing change. There are also gardens that flourish, work that matters." She took a limping step toward him. "And there is you." The honesty of her own words startled Sage, but there was no taking them back. It was said. The king closed the distance between them, stopping so close she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I am not an easy man, Sage. I carry the weight of an entire kingdom. Enemies in every shadow, decisions that cost lives. I cannot offer you a simple, quiet life. I've never had a simple life, she held his gaze, and quiet was never what I was looking for. Then what are you looking for? A place where I matter. Work? That means something. A pause. Someone who sees me as a person, not a category. His hands came up, cupping the sides of her face with a touch that was surprisingly gentle for such a large man. I see you. I always have. From the moment you walked into that hall covered in road dust, looking at me as an equal when everyone else treats me as a threat or a tool. His voice dropped, becoming hoarse. You scare me, Sage. Because you make me feel things I haven't felt in years. Because you make me want to protect when I've always been the one who needs to be protected. Because... He didn't finish. He just leaned in, bringing his face closer until their lips met. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant, testing. Then it deepened, intense, charged with everything that had been left unsaid, with fear and relief and desire intertwined. Sage's hands came up, gripping his shirt, pulling him closer despite the protest from her injured leg. When they pulled apart, they were both breathing heavily. Stay, he whispered against her forehead. Not as a servant, not as a gardener. Stay as... He searched for the right word. As my partner, as my advisor, as someone who matters. And you're caught. They'll hate it. Let them hate. We've already proven we can survive the worst betrayal they could orchestrate. The rest is just noise. Sage smiled, a true, wide smile for the first time since she had arrived at the fortress. Then I'll stay. A pause. But on a few conditions. He arched an eyebrow. Conditions. First, I manage the gardens my way. No interference. Second, I want the library made available. Knowledge shouldn't be a privilege. Third, she looked at him seriously. Honesty, always, even when it hurts. The king studied her, then nodded slowly. Accepted. But I have a condition too. Which is? You train in self-defense, sword, bow, hand-to-hand combat. I don't want to live in fear that next time I won't get there in time. It was concern disguised as an order. Sage saw right through it. Accepted. He pulled her into a careful embrace, mindful of her injured leg, but firm enough for her to feel the silent promise. Protection, partnership, a future being built right there. They stayed like that until the daylight died, completely, and candles were lit by servants entering discreetly. In the weeks that followed, the fortress changed. Sage prepared the plant, following ancient instructions, creating the remedy that would be taken to her sister by the king's trusted messenger. Lila sent a letter weeks later, her handwriting shaky but improving, saying the cough had subsided, that she could get out of bed, that she felt hope for the first time in months. The gardens expanded. Sage hired assistants, taught them techniques, and transformed the dead space into a living lung that fed not only the castle, but nearby settlements. Nobles, who had once scorned her, began to visit, asking for advice, offering cautious alliances. Darius became an unexpected ally, respecting her intelligence, protecting her when necessary. And the king? The king opened doors he had always kept closed. He included Sage in council meetings. He listened to her opinions on administration, on justice, on necessary changes. She challenged, questioned, and offered perspectives that men of power never considered because they had never lived without it. The relationship between them blossomed like the gardens, slowly, carefully, but inevitably. There was resistance. There were minor sabotage attempts. There were looks of contempt that took months to fade. But Sage had learned that belonging didn't come from accepting a designated place. It came from creating your own space and defending it tooth and nail. 6 months after her arrival, in a quiet but meaningful ceremony, the Alpha King publicly declared her his official partner. Not his wife, they were still navigating the political complexities of that, but a recognized partner, with her own voice and power. And on the night after the ceremony, lying together in the chambers they now shared, he held her hand in his. "Are you sure?" he asked softly. "There's still time." To back out. Sage turned on her side, meeting his eyes in the dim light. "I crossed hostile territory alone. I bargained with a king when everyone said it was madness. I survived an ambush on a frozen mountain." She laced her fingers through his. "I think I can handle a few grumpy nobles." He laughed, a rare, precious sound she treasured whenever she heard it. "A few grumpy nobles. Is that what you call potential traitors?" "I prefer to think of them as gardening projects," she smiled. "Difficult soil, but not impossible to work with." "And me? Am I a gardening project too?" "You?" Sage studied him fondly. "You are the earth I've chosen to cultivate, difficult, demanding, but worth every bit of effort." He pulled her closer, kissing her forehead, then her lips, slowly and deeply. "I never imagined a dust-covered Omega would change everything. I never imagined a cruel king would have a heart beneath his armor. I'm not cruel. You are. Just a little." She smiled against his lips. "But I'm working on it." And they were. Working, building, transforming. The fortress was still a place of cold stone and shadowy corridors. But in the flourishing, gardens, in the subtle changes spreading through the kingdom, in the way the king smiled when he thought no one was watching, something new was growing. Hope, possibility, a future neither of them had planned but both were actively choosing, day after day. Because sometimes salvation doesn't come from grand heroic gestures. It comes from a stubborn Omega who refuses to disappear. It comes from a king who learns to trust again. It comes from a garden that blooms in soil everyone had declared dead. And it comes, always, from the courage to plant, even when no one believes. Anything will grow. Sage looked out the window, seeing the first rays of sun touch the distant mountains where she had nearly died. She felt the king's hand tighten on hers, solid and sure. And she knew, with absolute clarity, that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. Not because it was easy, but because it was real. And truth, she had discovered, was a rarer luxury than any wealth the nobility flaunted. She turned, kissed him again, and whispered against his lips, "Thank you for seeing me. Thank you for insisting on being seen." And so, as the sun rose over a kingdom that still had much to change, two unlikely people, an Omega and a king, a survivor and a ruler, chose to face whatever came together. Because they had learned that the best stories are never about fates that are set in stone. They are about fates rewritten with hands dirty from the soil and hearts that refuse to harden.